the secret to his business success over the years was that he would bribe U.S. Navy personnel with these extravagant gifts or meals or parties and cash, hotel rooms, you name it. But with Leonard, everything was over the top. And in this case, he's not exaggerating when he's talking about his Christmas party. This was a party he organized in 2004 for the USS Abraham Lincoln, a carrier strike group that was visiting Hong Kong. And this dinner party cost $60,000. It was about $800 a person. And he had, lobster thermidor was one of his favorite main dishes. He had caviar, truffles. Of course, he served cigars, and not just any cigars. They had to be Cuban Cohiba cigar. As he described, he had what he called Santa Ninas, or Santa girls, who were several attractive young women in skimpy elf costumes parading around. He had a troop of bagpipers welcoming U.S. Navy personnel to this party, which was on the top floor of a five-star Hong Kong hotel overlooking the harbor. So with Leonard, everything was over the top. He wanted to wow his U.S. Navy friends. He wanted to give them a taste of the high life that he knew they would never be able to afford on their government salaries.
Right, and boy, it had an impact. In a way, and particularly the sex and the drinking is sort of rooted in this long history of sailors who, having been at sea for months, come ashore and want something a little more exciting than a sightseeing tour, right?
Exactly, and Leonard took advantage of that history, particularly in Asia, going back generations, when U.S. Navy ships would pull into port in places like Thailand or Malaysia or South Korea. There is a history of legalized or semi-legal prostitution that sailors would take advantage of, but it wouldn't be so crass as to just supply, for lack of a better description, sex workers off the street. He was only targeting the senior officers, admirals, ship captains, and he had to fly in what he saw as high-class sex workers from other countries who were, again, seen as a higher class level than Navy sailors might otherwise encounter.
Sure, to this you described so many of these. I mean, there were a lot of them, and you got an enormous amount of details. But he didn't just offer, booze, sex, and food. He was smart about approaching people who might need companionship. He also courted admirals and commanders' wives, too, didn't he?
He did. Leonard had a real knack for sensing people's weaknesses, or as he called them, their vices. He would put an arm around someone, a Navy officer or a law enforcement agent, and say, "Tell me, what are your vices?" And he'd laugh. He was very charming, but he was very direct. His sailor has a weakness, you just have to find it. So he would study people to see, who was having marital problems, who in the rumor mill had a drinking problem, who would be willing to take a small gift. He wouldn't just start out over the top with a big envelope of cash. He'd see who's willing to take a Cuban cigar, who's willing to take a small dinner, and then he'd escalate from there. Under federal ethics regulations, if you're in the Navy, you're only allowed to accept gifts worth $20 or less from a defense contractor like Leonard Francis. And again, it's important to remember that his company had millions of dollars in defense contracts with the Navy. So everyone in the Navy knew who Leonard Francis was, what his official job was, and that they were not supposed to accept gifts, at least not worth more than $20. But Leonard had this way where he would slowly reel people in. He would see who was willing to take a $50 gift, then a $100 gift, and before they knew it, he was giving them, thousands of dollars. And by that point, he had them over a barrel, and he could blackmail them if they didn't do what he wished.
Reading all this, I wondered how he had time to run a business. I guess this was running a business.
It is remarkable, his fortitude and his stamina, given, frankly, how big he is, and his health deteriorated over the years. But this was a big man. He weighed on average 350 pounds, but there were times when his weight ballooned out of control to 500 pounds, and yet he's flying all over Asia, sometimes the United States, going from port to port, to greet U.S. Navy senior officers whenever they pull in on a ship. And he was essentially a full-time concierge, having parties and dinners and just making sure these Navy officers were taken care of. But he was constantly on the go, flying business class from Singapore to Japan to Australia, day after day.
These events happened in the early 2000s, and by then, some women were making their way into the senior command ranks of the Navy. How did Leonard deal with that? Did they attend these parties? Did they hear about them and object? How did they figure in?